Chapter 7 Wreaths of Laurel. There are many stories about Apollo and those he loved, or who loved him. Two of his lovers were immortal. They live on, even today. One of those who loved Apollo was a water nymph named Slytai. She thought he was the most beautiful being in heaven or on earth. Day after day she stood with her lovely face lifted up to the heavens, watching him as he moved across the sky. Night after night she stood, too, her face turned to the east, waiting for him to appear. She gave no thought to anything but her golden god. She ate no food, she only drank dew and her own salt tears. But Apollo could find no love in his heart for Slytai. He felt only pity, as he saw the pretty thing pinning away. At last, in kindness, he changed her into a flower, tall and straight and beautiful. Thus she could stand and watch him always, fed by the earth, watered by the rain, and warmed by the god she loved. And because Apollo was touched by her love, he gave her great golden petals, like the rays of his own golden crown. So still she stands as she did in life, and still each day she turns her face to follow him, this flower that bears his name, the golden sunflower. There were also those whom Apollo loved himself. His first and greatest love was for a nymph named Daphne. This is their story. Apollo was proud of his skill with bow and arrow, and he was right to be proud, for did he not slay the terrible Python? But there was another god whose bow and arrows were famous too. He was a handsome boy named Eros, sometimes called Cupid. With his little wings and golden bow, Eros was helper to his mother, the goddess of love. One day Apollo came upon Eros playing with his little bow and arrows. The boy was shooting at apples and falling leaves. When Apollo saw him, he laughed at him. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked. "Bow and arrows are not toys for boys, but weapons for men to slay monsters with, as I slew Python." Eros did not like being laughed at. "That may be," he said to Apollo, "but my little arrow can wound even you, O great god of the sun." Apollo laughed again. He shouted his laughter at the very thought of a wound from such an arrow. Eros was angry. "And all your powers of healing could not cure your wound," he said. "You will see. Just wait." He spread his wings and flew away. A little later Apollo was hunting on a hillside. A nymph ran by him, with shining hair flowing in the wind. She was Daphne, daughter of a river god, and as lovely as anything Apollo had ever seen. At that moment Eros sent a golden arrow flying straight into Apollo's heart. On the instant the god was in love, madly in love. He called to Daphne to stop, but Eros had already shot another arrow at Daphne, and this one with a lead-tipped arrow, which made her hate the very thought of love. So Daphne only looked at the shining god with hate in her eyes. Then she ran off, leaving him standing there sick with love for her. Day after day Apollo looked for her on the hills and beside the rivers. Day after day he begged for her love, and always she turned her back on him. "I worship the goddess Artemis," she said, her bright eyes flashing. Like stars, thought Apollo. "I will always be a hunter like Artemis, and like her I will never marry." So Apollo cursed his own sister, the virgin goddess of cold silver moon, for stealing his loved one from him. Finally, he grew tired of begging. He could wait no longer. This time, when Daphne fled, Apollo followed, mad with love. How beautiful she was when she ran, he thought. How beautiful her bare arms were, and her face, her slender body, her shining hair. Loving the sight of her running, Apollo matched his steps to hers. How swift she was, and her strong brown feet were sure on the woodland path. Apollo knew she was a mate fit for a god. Suddenly he was wild to hold her in his arms. "I must," he thought, "now, this instant," and he began to run faster. Daphne looked back. She saw the god coming and was filled with fear. Down the hill she fled towards her father's river, shining in the valley. She ran like the wind. Her brown bare legs were strong and lovely. But her swift flight was not swift enough. Apollo, with his young god's strength, was soon close behind her. His reaching fingers could almost touch the ends of her flying hair. Then Daphne knew she could not reach the river in time. In despair she cried out to her father for help, and he heard her cry. At the moment that Apollo threw his arms around the frightened thing, she felt her flying feet rooted to the ground. She felt her body closed in something rough and hard. She felt her arms become stiff. And there, on the bank of the river, stood a tree of dark laurel green, its shining leaves in the sunlight. In place of Daphine's body, Apollo was holding in his arms was trembling trunk of a tree. Daphine's arms were now branches. Her head was a treetop, and her hair had changed to leaves. Their rustling in the wind was like a sigh as the god held her. For a moment more, the pounding heart beat on, inside the rough bark. Then it was still, forever. Saddened by his loss, Apollo took branches of the laurel and twisted them into a crown to wear around his head. "This way at least I can have her always with me," he said. "And because my love will never die, let the leaves on the laurel always be green." And so they're always green and shining, under the summer sun or winter snow, to this very day.